In this screencast, I'm going to be going over various topics related to ecology. A lot of ecology is sort of intuitive, like if you have wolves and deer, if there's more wolves, then the deer population will go down, for instance. Things you can probably figure out, but these are just a few topics that we haven't gotten to yet that will sort of round out our understanding of ecosystem level interactions. So let's start with nutrient cycling. In the previous screencast, we talked about how nutrients or matter cycle through an ecosystem while energy flows through an ecosystem. And we focused more on the energy side of that, but let's do a little bit more about the nutrient or matter side of that. An important sort of piece of vocabulary with this is the idea of fixation. There's nutrients that are needed for living things like nitrogen and carbon, nitrogen of course being involved in the production of DNA as well as amino acids for proteins. Nitrogen is needed for that, and carbon being needed for all organic molecules. And nitrogen and carbon exist mostly in gaseous form in the atmosphere as N2, nitrogen gas, and CO2, carbon dioxide gas. However, these two forms are not really readily accessible to living things. We'd say they are biologically unavailable. So you breathe in and out nitrogen gas all of the time, but you just breathe it in and you breathe it out. You can't access it when it's in this form to use it to make your amino acids and proteins. So fixation is taking these out of the air and converting them into forms that are usable by living things. And so we'll see how that happens in two cycles, the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle. So for carbon, we've already learned about how carbon is fixed. Carbon is fixed by plants or other photosynthetic organisms through photosynthesis. So that takes the carbon dioxide out of the air and converts it into a biologically available form, which is glucose. And then this diagram is just showing some of the other ways that carbon moves around the ecosystem. So plants get eaten by animals, they take in the carbon. Animals and plants perform cellular respiration, which puts carbon back into the air. Dead organisms can, over long periods of time, turn into fossil fuels like oil and coal, and then when those fossil fuels get burned, that carbon goes back into the air. Also, if we burn trees, carbon goes back into the air. So these are just kind of the basic ways that carbon moves around an ecosystem. And then here is the nitrogen cycle. Now the key part of the nitrogen cycle, again, is this fixation process, taking the N2 and turning it into usable things. And there's two ways that can happen. One is actually through lightning. Electricity will cause it to turn into a biologically available form. And then there's also these nitrogen fixing bacteria that are mostly in the soil. They can also be in the water that convert nitrogen into NH3, and then different bacteria can convert that into other forms of nitrogen. And these forms of nitrogen are able to be taken up by plants through their roots, and then animals can eat those plants to get that nitrogen. So that's how we get our nitrogen. We get it through food. Again, the bacteria transform it into biologically usable forms. It gets taken in by plants, and then animals eat it. Right. Next topic is population growth. How do populations grow? And there's two kind of models for how populations can grow. The first is exponential. So given an ideal environment, unlimited space, unlimited resources, etc., obviously this isn't realistic, but any population of any species will grow exponentially, which is this sort of J-shaped curve. So it's a doubling. So you go from 2 to 4 to 8 to 16 to 32, etc., and you get this shape of population size where it ends up sort of skyrocketing. So this is what we'll see oftentimes when, say, a new species is introduced to a new environment. For a while, they will be able to grow exponentially like this. However, due to the fact that eventually they will run into limits on their space, their food, other resources, like if you're a plant, sunlight is a resource. So if the plants all start shading each other out, that's a resource that they're competing for. Also, as organisms get more crowded, you can get easier spread of disease or accumulation of waste, which can be, hazardous to them. So realistically, populations eventually will start to grow logistically, meaning they'll be exponential for a while, but then they'll slow down as they start to hit those limiting factors and eventually sort of even out, and they'll settle at a level known as the carrying capacity. So the carrying capacity is the maximum population size that given ecosystem can support of that given organism. And you'll often see them kind of fluctuating around their carrying capacity. They might sometimes be a little more, sometimes be a little less, but generally populations will sort of stabilize around that line. Now let's look at the interactions between different species within one ecosystem. So we refer to sort of the role of the species in an ecosystem as its niche. And its niche is where it lives, how it gets its food, or how it meets its energy needs, etc. So in any given ecosystem, only one species can occupy each niche. So you might look at these sort of wading birds and think they're all in the same niche. They're all like wading in the water and getting food out of it. But actually, each of these different species is feeding at sort of a different level of the water, so they are all in sort of a different niche. So problems happen when we introduce invasive species. An invasive species is when a new species is introduced to an ecosystem, and let's face it, this is usually because of humans, accidentally or intentionally bringing in new species. And sometimes, that new species won't do very well in that ecosystem, but sometimes that new species might be able to take over niches from existing species. So these new species might proliferate and grow out of control and drive out native species from their niches. Oftentimes, these invasive species are able to reproduce very quickly, exponentially for a while, due to the fact that whatever their native predators are, the things that usually would kill them, don't exist in this new ecosystem. And so just a couple examples from Oregon, you're probably familiar with the blackberry bushes, the Himalayan blackberries. In our area, the Himalayan blackberries are taking over all kinds of land and spaces. It's actually pretty sad. You might think blackberries are delicious, but they're thorny and spiky, and they are definitely driving out our native plants. Another one, which I believe was an organism of the week once, is the lamprey, which is that horrible fish, the vampire fish that latches onto things with their little round serrated mouth. And those are killing fish in our rivers, like in the Columbia River, they're attacking the salmon. And so there are tons of invasive species all over the place, and some really interesting examples of invasive species out there if you want to look into those. Another role in an ecosystem is a keystone species. This is another vocabulary word. Basically, some species are disproportionately important in their ecosystem. Some species are kind of more important to the health of an ecosystem than others. And if that particular species, dies or is removed, it might cause just a catastrophe in the ecosystem, all different species populations crashing. An example is the sea otters in Monterey Bay. Coincidentally, my favorite animal in the world is a sea otter. And the sea otters were being hunted a lot for their fur. They have very thick, soft fur. And what happened was, as the sea otter population started going down, sea otters eat sea urchins a lot. And so when the sea otter population started going down, the sea urchin population started going up a lot. And the sea urchins eat the kelp, which is essential for pretty much everything that lives in those kelp forest ecosystems. So the sea otters were gone, so the sea urchins were killing all of the kelp, and so just everything was dying. Now sea otter populations are making a rebound since they're not, legal to be hunted in there for their fur. But that showed how sea otters really are a keystone species to the Monterey Bay, California coastal kelp forest ecosystems. And so there are some different types of relationships between different species, again, living in the same ecosystem. And we call those relationships symbiosis. You might think of symbiosis as two organisms that are like helping each other, but actually symbiosis is just a general term for any two organisms that have a relationship in an ecosystem that's not like one of them is eating the other one. So one type of symbiosis is parasitism, so parasites. In parasitism, one species is getting a benefit, the parasite, and the other species is being harmed. So can you think of an example of a parasite? So this is a really cool example. This is the cordyceps fungus. The cordyceps fungus parasitizes insects, and they're kind of in the Amazon rainforest area. And what happens is the insect gets infected with this fungus, which sort of almost takes over its brain. It makes it go kind of crawl to a high place, and then the fungus erupts from the insect, killing it, and can kind of rain down its spores on other, members of that insect's population. Another type of symbiosis is commensalism. In commensalism, one species benefits and the other isn't really hurt, but they aren't really helped either. They're kind of neutral about it. An example of this is barnacles on whales. So barnacles will grow on whales. Doesn't really affect the whale at all, but the barnacle, as an immobile organism, kind of gets a free ride, and they can pick up the little bits of food and stuff that the whale misses. So the barnacle is benefiting, the whale doesn't really care. And then the last type of symbiosis, and probably the one that you think of when you think of symbiosis, is mutualism. So in mutualism, it is mutual. Both species are benefiting from this relationship. So can you think of an example of that? There's lots of examples out there. I like this one. This is a type of bat, and this is a pitcher plant. And the bats will actually kind of use the pitcher plant as a little hiding place, like a little sleeping bag. They'll go into the pitcher plant and they can hide during the day, and the pitcher plant gets a benefit because it gets fertilized by the bat's droppings. So in this example, both species are benefiting, and also it's pretty cute. The last topic I want to talk about, it's not really ecology, but it's just the last thing we need to check off our list, is theories around the origins of life. Where did that first life come from? And obviously there, again, is a biblical explanation for this, but this is the scientific explanation. And to be honest, there's a lot we don't know about how life originated, but we do know that certain key events must have taken place. So timescale-wise, Earth forms about 4.6 billion years ago, but up until about 3.9 billion years ago, the environment on Earth was just way too hostile for life. It was very, very hot. There was no atmospheric oxygen. There was no liquid water because it was so hot. And also, the planet was frequently being bombarded by meteors. Things start to settle down somewhere between 3.9 and 3.5 billion years ago, and that's when our very first fossils, our earliest fossils, we can find date from. So we know that the first life probably developed sometime between 3.9 and 3.5 billion years ago. So remember when I talked about there were certain steps that would have had to happen in order for life to come about. And the first step towards life is organic molecules. So carbohydrates, proteins, lipids. We need to have these molecules for life. So these molecules must have had to be synthesized from non-living sources. Now, generally, as a rule, we say organic molecules only come from living things. So, one of the explanations for how organic molecules could have come from non-living things is this organic soup model. Basically, the idea is that today we don't have organic molecules coming from non-living sources, but in the past, the environment of the Earth was very different. There was no oxygen, it was hotter, there was lots of lightning happening. And so this is a famous experiment, the Miller-Urey experiment, where they simulated the early Earth environment. So they had water, they heated it up to the temperature that the ocean kind of would have been. They also simulated lightning, and they put in, the ingredients, the elements that would have been present in that early Earth environment. And what they found was when they ran the water through this system, heated it, ran it through the lightning, etc., organic molecules were formed. Some amino acids were formed spontaneously in this simulated early Earth environment, which showed that it could have been possible for organic molecules to be formed from non-organic sources. The next step in creating life, we've created organic monomers like amino acids. So now those small molecules must have had to join together to form our larger macromolecules like proteins and carbohydrates. Next, one of the requirements for life is a cell membrane, and that's something that we have in common with all life. And so there are these sort of organisms that can form called protobionts. Basically, if you have phospholipids, they will spontaneously arrange themselves into this double membrane shape because of their nature being polar and non-polar, and the polar parts will hide on the inside. And so little membrane bubbles that spontaneously formed and had some contents that were different from the outside, maybe contained some of those organic molecules like amino acids and carbohydrates. Those would be called protobionts. And so they're not quite life because they don't contain DNA and they don't really have replication, but they did have kind of a simple metabolism using these early organic molecules, and they were able to produce energy. So they're not quite alive, but they're getting pretty close. And so the last step in the origin of life is self-replicating genetic molecules, inheritance. And we know that the first inheritance molecule, the first genetic molecule, was RNA. RNA came before DNA. RNA is simpler, it's single-stranded, and so the very first living things had RNA rather than DNA. However, after DNA developed, evolution favored DNA more because RNA is more prone to errors during replication, and it's also less stable. It's more prone to breaking down since it doesn't have that double helical structure. And so sort of the last step is this transition from RNA to DNA. And so obviously there's a lot of stuff left out of, how did this go to this and this go to this, but this is sort of a basic outline of our understanding of how the earliest life probably developed.